5. Not waving. "I'm fine," the woman told them. "I'm fine," the woman told herself. "As long as I keep treading water, I'll be fine. Just keep treading. Just keep kicking. Keep your head above the water and you'll be okay." But the water was getting colder and darker. The waves were getting bigger. Fatigue slowed her muscles and exhaustion threatened to pull her under. "I'm fine," the woman told herself. "I still smile. Life is good. Life has never been better. I still joke. There's a lot to laugh about." The children were smart and independent and loving. They were the best thing that ever happened to her. The 6-year-old was quirky and wise beyond his years. The 4-year-old had a huge heart and made up nonsensical knock-knock jokes. And the 2-year-old was fierce and funny and full of love. There was a lot to laugh about, but the woman found herself laughing less and less. Maybe it was her bank balance that was weighing on her. That wasn't so funny. Every time she saw a glimmer of hope that her books were selling, her life was working. When she glimpsed at her inevitable success, she thought, "I was right. It's going to be okay. I always knew it was going to be okay." Then she'd look at her hungry credit card and feel the shame flame her cheeks. No matter how hard she kicked, she was still going under. It wasn't just the notes and coins and the numbers on the screen. Money was her security blanket. On good days, it warmed her shoulders. On bad days, she couldn't find it anywhere and felt bereft. Every time she built up a cushion of hope and finally rested on it, it got pulled out from underneath her. Unexpected bills choked her. The money flowing away felt like fingers around her neck slowly squeezing. Feelings of failure strangled her. The scrutiny of strangers was nothing new. She'd always hated attention, would rather have spiders crawl over her body than speak in public. The spotlight made her sweat. As a preschooler, she chose to be spanked rather than participate in show and tell. They forced her to talk, forced her to eat even when she retched. Spanking and strawberry jam sandwiches. She still can't eat strawberry jam. As a toddler, she locked her mother out of the car before school, made her promise she'd never have to go back to the place that made her retch. The mother hid her under her desk at work until she found a better creche. The old jam-scented memories surfaced when the woman attended a meeting with her 2-year-old's preschool teacher. "She won't speak to the class," the teacher said. "She doesn't like to be the center of attention." The woman's stomach contracted. "Nor do I," she replied. "Nor does my mother." A genetic curse. Sometimes fear travels like disease through generations. "She'll come out of her shell," the teacher said. "She's only 2. But the woman knew better. The woman kept kicking, but she was getting tired. She realized she'd been exhausted for years. When she was pregnant with her 3rd child, the obstetrician asked her how she was feeling. "Exhausted," she had replied. He laughed. He had 3 kids of his own. He woke up at 3 a.m. every weekday to prepare for surgeries and was on call 24/7. "You're not going to get any less exhausted," he said. After 7 years of cycling through infertility, pregnancy, breastfeeding, and sleep deprivation, the woman sometimes felt that her body was nothing less than a miracle. In bleaker times, she felt that it had been leached all the way down to the marrow. If you cut open her bones, you'd find nothing but white sand. The water was getting darker still. The woman would cope. She had always coped. She was naturally optimistic, persistent, resilient. She knew how to push herself. She knew how to achieve goals. She kept kicking. She thought she was fine, but then realized her babies were in the water with her. Her sons could swim, but her daughter couldn't. The woman knew that you couldn't hold a baby and keep yourself afloat at the same time. Her sons were scared, hanging on to her and yelling. She couldn't hear what they were saying past the roar of panic in her head. They didn't mean to, but they were pulling her down. The 2-year-old, terrified, began to scream. The woman used to think the world was a safe place. It's not. Danger is a swift enemy. You think you'll have time to react, to fend off the peril, but bad things happen quickly. The woman's baby almost died. The night before, the baby was running around with her brothers and eating pizza for dinner. The next morning, her breathing was coming in short puffs. At the ER, the woman and the doctor fought with the baby, holding down her thrashing arms to insert the IV into her tiny vein. They plunged a needle into her thigh, pumping her body full of adrenaline. The paramedics were kind. "Don't panic," they told the woman, setting out their intubation equipment in the ambulance. "We probably won't need this, but kids are unpredictable." The woman stayed at her baby's side, holding her hand, stroking her head. 7 days and 7 nights. She slept on a stretcher and showered in the middle of the night to make sure her daughter wouldn't wake up alone in the strange room. She nebulized the baby every 6 hours and called the nurses every time the child's breathing became labored. They began to roll their eyes, but she didn't care. There was some sad news. Their beautiful cat, a loyal friend of 10 years, had died while the woman and child were being held hostage at the hospital. The woman paced the room, crying, feeling like she was going mad. Just a week before, life had been happy and full of hope. They'd just bought a bigger house. Book sales were climbing. The children were thriving. The woman felt too lucky. She had been right. The woman cried when her baby got better, and cried when her baby got worse. The tide rose and fell, rose and fell. She was a piece of broken driftwood being dashed against the rocks. The baby railed against the perpetual IV line, the oxygen tubes plastered to her nose. She wanted to leave the room, but she was a prisoner in her metal crib. Desperate, the screaming infant did everything she could to escape. The woman pretended to be strong while her daughter was awake and wept into her soft muslin sheet while she slept. It was a long and slow process, but the baby recovered. Finally, out of the hospital, they spent hours together on the armchair while the woman held the nebulizer against her baby's nose and mouth. Traumatized, the child fought the medicine as she had in the hospital. It was cuddle time, the woman would say. Story time. They both got used to it. They had survived. They were still alive, but the woman felt as if she had been struck by lightning. She had a constant echo in her head. It was wordless, but it always held the same message. The world is not a safe place. The world is not a safe place. The world is not a safe place. The woman began seeing danger everywhere. She was living in a new reality where her brain was filled with the television screen static of anxiety. Headlines assaulted her. Polar bears starved to death, nations elected predators to presidents, and rape was a national sport. Men shot their fiancés in the face. The woman began to read less news to protect her state of mind, but it didn't stop the long-abused planet from being ravaged by flooding and fire. The stories and the bodies piled up, and she felt the weight of them on her shoulders and in her stomach. She went to bed overwhelmed and woke up exhausted. Noises startled her. The clang of a teaspoon dropping on the floor spiked her adrenaline so hard she felt like running. Irritable and on edge, the voices of her own children had grated her. Being gradually eroded, she stopped dancing in the kitchen, stopped trying to make her kids laugh. She didn't answer the phone. Friends and family chatted and laughed. The woman laughed along, but deep down her mind was saying, "Don't you know my baby almost died? I would have died too." But you don't say that in polite conversation. You don't say that while everyone's talking about power cuts and drought and travelling to Panama and craft gin. While the woman's mind wandered to the ambulance ride, the needles, the blood on her baby's pacifier. On dark nights, the woman sticks a needle into her own heart. You should have taken her to the doctor sooner. You should have taken a stand with the nurses. You should have done more. If she had stopped breathing, it would have been your fault. You are her mother. The world is not a safe place. My baby almost died. I would have died too. The woman and her family survived. They began to settle into their new house. The remaining cat mourned her lifelong friend for months. The woman sometimes felt a ghost feline wrap his tail around her legs, only to look down and see nothing, just the shadows that had crept in, reminding her of her new dangerous world and the dark water. The bigger house was wonderful and cursed at the same time. The pool was a warm oasis that would keep the children occupied for hours, and at the same time it was a cold, black abyss that would haunt the woman's dreams, her baby drowning in it over and over. The big, beautiful tree in the front garden she had fallen in love with while house hunting turned out to be infested with tiny moth-like insects that drifted down like snow in summer. The tree sprayed black all over the cheerful walkway, all over the white walls. During water restrictions, there was a leak beneath the house that cost thousands and thousands in lost water alone. In Cape Town, the drought was so dire that people were queuing for water. The knowledge twisted inside her. She couldn't look at the invoice. She was still hurting from the hospital bill. Because of the massive leak, the beautiful parquet flooring began to lift. The wooden tiles damaged beyond repair. The woman didn't want to guess what other devastation the water had wrought below the ground. She imagined that soon the whole house would collapse into a hole. When it rained, the house was a sieve. The children would tear around hunting for leaks. They would put down buckets, bowls, towels, bath mats. More timber tiles lifted. The grass died. The courtyard lemon tree was attacked by mold. The pool turned green. Once, while the woman was working, there was a small movement in her peripheral vision. She looked across and saw a mouse scampering down the banister. She had a sudden and irrational urge to burn the house to the ground. "We're just getting used to it," they told themselves and each other. "We'll be able to keep up with the maintenance soon." But the working hours were relentless, and the children more so. The electric gate stopped working. Load shedding meant they'd go without electricity for hours every day. Sometimes the water was cut off too. Another burst pipe, this time under their driveway, which refused to be fixed. The woman fought the feelings of despair, but they fought back. The children loved their new schools and grew like weeds. They always demanded more than the woman could give them. She loved them fiercely and without restraint. Her eyes pricked with tears when she hugged them goodnight and smelled their warm, sweet skin. They were everything, but they also took everything. "Stop growing," she used to tell them. "I want you to stay small forever. I want you to be mine forever. I love you too much." The days were long. The woman and the man were in survival mode. Some days were easier than others. They would look at each other over their mugs of tea at night, relishing the silence of slumbering children, and say, "It's getting easier, isn't it? They're such great kids. They're doing so well." Some days, getting the children to school seemed impossible. 3 mouths to feed, 3 bodies to wrangle, 3 sets of teeth to brush. Don't forget the sunscreen or the hats or the snacks or the library bag or show and tell. Don't forget to enjoy every moment because they're only small once. Late for school and rushing, the 4-year-old threw a tantrum and refused to walk. The woman ground her teeth and forcefully strapped him into the pram and put the 2-year-old on the wheelie board behind. The toddler didn't want to be there and kept hopping off until the woman forced her back on and scolded her with a violent whisper. They both began to howl. The 6-year-old was upset. He was late for school. He was worried he'd get a black mark. Cars sped past them. It began to rain, and in her rush to leave the house, she had forgotten her umbrella. The woman's anxiety ramped up to a new, all-time high. A stone burned in her throat. Don't forget to enjoy every moment. The woman focused on the good times. She reminded herself to breathe, to spend time in nature. She led a privileged life and had little reason to complain. She kept treading the water. Things were going to get better. The man complained of chest pain. The woman made him take an aspirin. A year before, she wouldn't have worried. He was healthy and in great shape, but the lightning bolt had taught her to fear. It's not just children who are unpredictable. The pain went away for a week, then came back late one night. They packed a hospital bag and called an Uber. The woman wanted to go with her husband to the ER, but had to stay home with the children who were fast asleep in bed. She paced the room, the office, the kitchen, waiting for his messages. When she got tired of pacing, she sat and forced her adrenaline into her work. She couldn't think straight. Finally, the text arrived. The man was okay. His heart was fine. ECGs don't lie. Stress, they wondered? Panic attack? Acid reflux? The man has always been a stressed Eric. He had a short emotional fuse and his first ulcer when he was 12. The next time he had chest pain, they ignored it. It went away. When it came back, it was more intense. He made an appointment with a well-respected cardiologist just for peace of mind. The consultation was weeks away. They continued in survival mode. Had they ever not been in survival mode? Wasn't that what life was, for most people anyway? The pain didn't go away. On a bicycle ride in the middle of nowhere, the man felt off color. The woman was worried but reminded herself of the ECG. His heart was fine. The woman had 3 children pulling and hanging on her like nagging vervet monkeys. They were hungry, they were fighting, they needed a bath, they needed their mum. The woman didn't have time to worry about a healthy heart, so she pushed it down into the black water she was treading. In a parallel world, her husband was swimming at the gym in a pool so clear it looked like glass. When he pushed off under the water, he felt his heart squeeze. The man remembered the story of an acquaintance who had died in a pool and then was slowly brought back to life. The man got out of the water. The cardiologist's consultation went well. The doctor was about to sign the clean bill of health when it came to the end of the stress test, where the man had to run on a treadmill, his strong-looking heart hooked up to the monitor. "I don't like what I saw at the end of the stress test," the doctor said on the phone to the woman. What did he see? "I didn't like the way he looked. I want him to come in for an angiogram." What could the woman say? She wasn't going to argue with one of the best cardiologists in the country. The doctor recommended doing it on that Friday. He had an anaesthetist ready to help. Should he go ahead and book the procedure? The man said no. He felt fine. After all, he had an important meeting on Friday. The doctor pushed again for Friday, but the man booked it 3 days later, on the Monday morning. Friday arrived, and it was time for the man to leave for the important meeting. He put his helmet on, then took it off and sat on the couch, rubbing his chest, as had become his habit. He sprayed his new medication under his tongue. The cardiologist had said if he had felt any heart pain, he was to use the spray. If he needed to use it a second time, he must go straight to the ER. "Don't wait to phone me," he had said. "Just get straight to the hospital and call me on the way." After the first spray, his chest pains were not abating. He sprayed again. He felt better and put his helmet back on. The woman's nerves were so shot she felt like her hair was on fire. She insisted her husband listen to the cardiologist's advice. The man tried to call the doctor, but the line was busy. "I'll call him on the way," he said. He meant to the meeting, not the ER. At that moment, if there existed an Insta-divorce app, the woman would have used it. He rode halfway down the block when his doctor called him back and told him to meet him in surgery immediately. The cardiologist called the woman a few hours later. "It's called a widowmaker," he said. "The most fatal heart attack you get." The world is not a safe place. During the angiogram, they discovered the man had a critical narrowing of his left anterior artery, the most crucial pipeline of the heart. If that gets blocked, your whole heart collapses. "It wasn't a matter of if he would have died," said the surgeon. "It's when he would have died." Which, the woman thought, you could say about anybody on earth, but she took his point. She was listening intently, wanting to know every detail. She wanted to know about the stent they had inserted, but she couldn't escape the noise of the kids who were laughing and playing and shouting. "The anaesthetist called him a ticking time bomb." The man had cheated death, and the woman had narrowly escaped a personal tragedy of unfathomable proportions. The children were 2, 4, and 6 years old. When she collected her husband from the hospital, they high-fived each other and hugged. They had been so lucky. They had dodged a fatal bullet. They had wrenched the man away from the precipice. It would have been healthy to take a week off then, to process the trauma, seek counseling. But just because you almost lose your husband doesn't mean you can stop to think about it. There was double the work to do while he recovered. Squawking mouths to feed, school meetings, cookie sales, headaches, more hospital bills, more deadlines to meet, more dark nights of thinking about how close they had come. The black water kept rising, and the woman kept treading. She was only just keeping her kids afloat, and now the man had joined them too. Some of the stories the woman wrote were disturbing. Sometimes she chose the story, and sometimes the story chose her. One was about a mother who drowns her children. The research was harrowing, and the woman lay awake at night with the sheer heart-rendering horror of it. She avoided the story of the lost children for as long as she could, but it demanded to be written. The work was both the woman's escape and her reason for getting up in the mornings. It was what she was meant to do. Write, publish, repeat. Build an empire that could pay the bills. She needed to keep going, keep reaching. A good writing session energized her and made the world feel right. Her craving to create was deeper than her need to rest. Her phone kept ringing and buzzing, emails pinged, messages vibrated. Everyone wanted to talk, talk, talk. The house maintenance drained her. The kids pecked at her. People said she was such a hard worker, but what they didn't see was the escape it gave her, the energy it afforded her. They didn't see the bedrock inside her, that it was entirely made up of the words she had written and the words she was yet to write. But even with the freedom her work gave her, she couldn't get away from the approaching thundercloud that pulsed with imminent danger. As the darkness swirled in, the static notched up. She didn't feel like herself. Nightmares of her baby dying in the ambulance. Children can be unpredictable. In the hospital room, in her cot at home. Dreams of her children disappearing or being knocked over by cars. Her husband lying on the bottom of a pool made of glass. Her books turning into small white leech-like worms in her hands. The eggs were in the paper, the printer in her terror dreams said. Burn them all, she told him. He shook her head. It's too late. Your books are hatching all over the world. The woman remembered the movie scene where Julianne Moore's character, a housewife, wants to kill herself. She bakes her son a birthday cake, leaves him with a neighbor, then goes to a hotel room to commit suicide. She lies on the bed and has visions of the room being filled with water. She's on the island in the middle, lying on her back, looking at the ceiling as the water rises. At the last minute, she decides to live. She wrenches her own body off the precipice and escapes to start a new life. Running away from her family was not an option for the woman. There'd be no point. Her husband and children were the point. They were where the rawness was, the joy and the pain, the anger and love, and the relentless tug of life. But it was too much. I don't know how you do it, people said. How do you cope? I'm not coping, the woman said. I feel completely overwhelmed all the time. But that's not what people want to hear. One night, her husband was working, and she, trying to meet a deadline and failing, started cooking dinner late. The children were all talking to her at the same time. Her right eye had been twitching for weeks. The 4-year-old climbed onto the counter and accidentally knocked down a bottle of plum sauce, which shattered all over the floor. The baby, barefoot, wouldn't listen when the woman warned her to stay back from the shards of glass. The lump in her throat swelled so much it felt she couldn't breathe past it. It was a ball of fire she couldn't swallow. She went for days and days, feeling close to tears, blinking them away, telling herself to pull herself together. The tears were puzzling. She wasn't sad. She had a lucky life. Too lucky. What is wrong with me? She demanded as she scraped the syrupy sauce off the floor. Am I going mad? It was a legitimate question. There was a history of mental illness in her family. She has always had a bright, resilient mind. She thought she was immune. The static took over her life when she wasn't looking. Her eyes were open, but her vision was crowded with sticky hands and urgent appeals for everything but rest. It's just a very demanding time of life, she told herself. It's not going to get any less demanding, she heard her obstetrician riff. The woman knew she could run away, but she didn't want to. She could stop working, but stopping writing would just be a different kind of suicide. I'm not coping, the woman told her husband. It hurt her to admit it. Their friends joked about her invisible superhero cape. It didn't make sense to her. The year before had been the challenging time, and she had coped. The 6-book contract, the gaping credit card deficit, the late nights, the health scares. The dark water rose and fell, and then rose higher than before. Things were going well. The kids were thriving. The woman's career had notched up. This year's easier, she kept telling herself, except that for some reason, it wasn't. She battled to write. She couldn't grasp common words, and her thoughts were being choked by the static. She thought it was a phase and kept trying, but day after day the anxiety shut down her brain. It became harder to get out of bed in the mornings. Her hair began to break when she brushed it, and then began to fall out. Nightmares haunted her. She couldn't tread anymore. She commanded her legs to keep kicking, but they were no longer responding. It's not as dramatic as a snapping tendon. It's a gradual slowing down to a stop, and then, helpless, you begin to sink. She knew she had to get out of her head, but she didn't know how. She postponed some publishing deadlines and took some time off. One day, while walking home, the hot stone in her throat began to choke her. Standing on the sidewalk in the shade of the jacaranda trees, she hyperventilated and wept. She wasn't sad. She didn't know where the tears had come from. But she knew it was time to get help. 3 weeks after she had refused the idea of medication, she was in her doctor's office. The number of a cognitive behavioral therapist and a prescription for anti-anxiety drugs clutched in her clammy hands. You take this one for the anxiety, but it might make you feel more anxious in the beginning. So you take this one too, just until your body adjusts. It was a relief to hold the boxes of pills in her hands. For 2 nights in a row, on the new medication, despite one of them being a sedative, her eyes clicked open at 2 a.m. and her heart and mind raced. During the day, the world looked different. Her hands sweated on the keyboard, her legs swung on their own accord, and she couldn't settle her mind enough to write. "Here's something to help you sleep," said the doctor. Uh-oh, the woman thought, taking the 3rd prescription on top of the other 2. I know how this story ends. I've seen the movies. I know the tropes. You keep taking more and more until your life implodes. But that's not what happened. As her body adjusted to the drugs, life slowed down and the static faded. The woman began to feel lighter. She began noticing the beautiful trees on their street again, the orange pop of the autumn leaves swirling around them as they walked to school. She stopped rushing everywhere and felt the breeze on her skin. Her body felt healthier. Her hair stopped falling out. She began enjoying her children again, laughing with them and dancing in the kitchen. When she hugged them, the embrace was no longer tinged with fear. The woman started kissing her husband again. Recent symptoms she hadn't attributed to anxiety began to fade. Her fingers stopped trembling. Her memory improved. She could write again. She realized that swallowing the small white pills every morning wasn't about giving in. It was about protecting her body and her brain. The world was burning, and she loved her children too much. They were living in an eroded reality, and she needed all the armor she could get. The dark water started to drain away, and she could finally breathe easily and rest her legs. The thunderclouds that had been crashing towards her retreated. The woman pulled her family closer, and they stood like that, huddled together, as the sun began to burn through the fog. The 4-year-old told one of his silly knock-knock jokes, and they all laughed. And it felt real and raw and good, and there were no more tears to fight. The hard stone in her throat had melted away. "I'm fine," the woman told herself, and she realized it was no longer a lie.